Hello and welcome to the podcast on negotiation. Today with a very special guest with Michael Koplovsky. Michael, great to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thank you very much, Remy, for having me.
Michael is a Renaissance man of modern careers. His career spans from being a diplomat, then working in business, being a lobbyist, being a professor, right? Michael, is there anything that you cannot do?
There's a long list of things I cannot do, and even the list you gave me, I'm not sure if I'm the best or the brightest or the model for those jobs.
Anyway, it's great to have you with us because I was thinking about shedding together with you. I was thinking about shedding some light on the world that usually stays behind the curtains.
Mhm.
Yes, and talk a little bit about lobbyism, about lobbying, lobbyism, lobbyists, and the extent to which lobbyism and lobbyists need to be great negotiators. Michael, let us start with your path to lobbyism. How did you become a lobbyist?
Sure. I guess I became a lobbyist almost by accident, right? As you talked about, my background was as in diplomacy, as a U.S. diplomat for many, many years, and also a trade negotiator. Negotiated a lot of trade agreements in Latin America, the Caribbean, free trade agreement with Morocco. I was also involved with the TTIP negotiations with the EU, between the United States and the EU for the free trade agreement. Uh, and After a career of using these skills of relationship building, of advocacy, of negotiation, when I left the civil service, the foreign service, the diplomatic corps. Some companies were very interested in those skills, the relationships that I had built, the interpersonal skills that you use in negotiation and diplomacy and advocacy for their use of advocating for private sector interests. For a particular company, I worked for a large US high tech company known to many, for Amazon. Actually, if you look here on LinkedIn, you can find that. In Brussels, in fact, because I had experience with working in Brussels twice at the US mission and had some relationships, understand how EU comitology and lawmaking works and how interests are expressed and reconciled within the EU process, and spent about 2.5 years with Amazon. Really enjoyed my time there, taking these skills and applying them in private sector, but also learning about the unique aspects of private sector. It's about operations and efficiency and profit and loss and serving customers in a way that maybe being a diplomat or being a civil servant didn't. I'd always thought throughout my diplomatic career that I really was a lobbyist already. I was a lobbyist for the United States of America, and I was advancing the interests and positions of my country, whether it was in the Middle East or in the Caribbean or in Europe or Sub-Saharan Africa or wherever I was serving, or in Washington or multilaterally at the OECD or at the UN, where I also negotiated multilaterally. It was always pursuing and promoting the interests of the United States of America and the American people. And it turns out that there's a lot of overlap between that and advancing the interests of a company, of a particular industry, a sector company, or trade association group to which Amazon or belonged, that I would participate in. But there's also a lot of differences. And I'll be happy to explore some of those today with you, to try to demystify and pull the curtain back on what lobbying is. I think so too many people, think that there's something a little bit mysterious or perhaps even sinister about
Sketchy.
lobbying, when in fact lobbying is just the way that interests are expressed, right? In governmental and in policymaking and regulation and legislation. It's true, companies have pretty deep pockets and spend a lot of money hiring people like me and consultancies and spending money on public campaigns to change minds. But lobbying is also done by other groups too. It's done by environmental groups and NGOs. It's done by consumer groups that protect and defend the rights of consumers. It's done by groups that have certain political leanings, or by countries themselves that also, in addition to diplomacy, have lobbyists that work for them as well. And I've always thought that in lobbying, you want to make sure that there are channels for interest to be expressed to make the best possible legislation, regulation, rules. It's when everybody makes their best case and when everybody tries their best to persuade those who are making the decisions, or that a consensus emerges with some compromise. And if everyone is working their best, making their best case and working their hardest, the solution that emerges after all of the lobbying is done by all the varying and different sides that I mentioned is often the best kind of regulation, legislation, laws, rules that could emerge. So that's a little bit of how I got where I am and why I thought it was a logical step, and why I think that the private sector also thought that I was someone that might be able to help them in their lobbying efforts.
I would like to pick on the last bit that you've mentioned, and especially from the perspective of pressure. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
when was it harder? Was it harder to deal with the pressure and expectations of the constituencies when you negotiate on behalf of 300 million people, as a diplomat for working for the U.S. Department of State, or was it more difficult when you lobbied for a commercial enterprise with objectives, goals, and financial market pressure on their stock price? When was it easier? When was it harder from your perspective?
So your audience, of course, are most of them have really good background in negotiation. So I'm going to use some of that terminology, I suppose. We all have our ratifiers, right? We all have the people that have to approve of whatever we're doing and tell us what they need, what their interests are. And we as advocates are the ones who are expressing those needs, desires, preferences, but they're not uniform, right? In the background, there's all different interests. And believe me, in the United States of America, there are varying political interests, economic interests, social interests that come to play when America has a position, right? The United States of America, the government position is filtered through our democratic processes, our members of Congress and our senators, our elected presidents, also people who lobby in Washington, right? I mean, they're also lobbying regulatory agencies and civil servants and bureaucrats, again, from all sides, not just companies. Uh, Also public interest groups, also groups that are in favor of, as I said, all different interests that are coming to play. And as a diplomat, I think I always knew that these interests were behind whatever I was doing, and they constrain you in a way that you have to understand where the guardrails are, where you can't go past this, because then you will lose a certain constituency, a certain ratifier for that. In private sector, I found there are ratifiers as well. Within a company, unless it's a very small company, there's all kinds of different interests with the company, right? There's the parts of the company that are very interested in reputation, or maybe furthering goals of sustainability and saving the planet. There are other parts of the company that really are pushing for efficiencies and return on investments and capital expenditures. And there are other parts of the company that are looking to financially, like how can we maximize our financial return. And there are others that are very interested in satisfying or delighting the consumers, the customers. And these overlapping, sometimes competing interests are also ratifiers that we all, as lobbyists in Brussels or Washington or wherever in the world, have to be aware of, have to understand, and have to channel, deconflict, and also channel these interests as we embark on our advocacy efforts.
Hmm. So harder at Amazon or harder at the U.S. Department of State?
I don't know. Harder. Saying something's harder. They're different, right? Different doesn't
They
mean
are
harder
different.
or
Okay.
easier. And I also feel like private sector is a bit different. I said to someone once, it was like exercising different muscles that I hadn't used before. When you take up a new sport, right? At first you're like, "Oh, that kind of hurts," but then you get good at whatever it is.
Well, which means, for a Renaissance man like you, probably nothing is hard. It just requires a little bit of practice. All right, Michael. So let's have a look at let's demystify lobbying. Yeah, so, what does a lobbyist do when they work?
So again, I think in some ways I drew on a lot of my experience as a negotiator and as a diplomat in terms of my lobbying. And you had quipped a little bit just now that nothing is too hard. You just have to like practice it a little bit and then you get to it. Um, that's not untrue, right? I think that what is lobbying? Lobbying often starts off in its early stages, looks like preparing for a negotiation or preparing for some sort of public affairs campaign. I think those that do their homework, that really understand the issue deeply, that go into the details, understand both your positions and the positions of anyone else who has an interest that would be either supporting you or opposing you or trying to come at it from a different point of view, that you understand the aspects of any given issue. What did Sun Tzu said about, the every war is won or lost before it even happens, right? Before it begins, because it's true. If you do all the preparation beforehand, then you are best armed in order to do that. And so I feel like the relationship part is also important. That's the second part. So the first part is do your homework, understand. The second part is relationships. And I think lobbyists build relationships with those areas in their purview. If you're working on particular issues, whether they're dealing with digital technology, AI, algorithms, or you're dealing with environmental protection, or you're dealing with consumer protection, you build the relationships with those who are the elected legislators, the parliamentarians, in the case of Brussels European parliamentarians, MEPs, or national politicians. You also talk to the regulators, the experts within the Commission, within the national governments of the EU members. You build these relationships not when you need something from them, but in order to have the trust that you're building beforehand, so that you can have the difficult conversations or easy conversations later on, when you can have the access to say, you know me, you know that I'm not just parachuting into your office and asking you for something. We've had a conversation before. You know that I'm interested in this. I'm interested in what you have to say too. We have open communication and trust. We understand that when we have a conversation, we're not trying to mislead each other or manipulate each other. We're trying to actually have a good and constructive conversation. This also works when you're having difficult conversations with those that don't agree with you, right? And I think that lobbyists, diplomats, and negotiators alike often have to deal with people that come from a very different position, maybe even one that looks a bit confrontational or looks to the opposite. But in fact, keeping the lines of communication open and the trust open is very important to how you can have these conversations going on. So I do think this idea of preparation, this idea of trust building, building relationships and networks of people that you can both learn from and collect intelligence, as it were, of what is the status of a particular issue, how is it developing, but also to have the conversations where everyone begins to understand the needs and desires of the other side better in order to get to a place where everybody can support what's going to happen going forward.
That's amazingly simple, unless we dig deeper into one of the aspects that you mentioned, and that is relationship building. Yes, because that's probably the most. I don't want to say the most mysterious part of it, but I guess that's the part where many people are thinking, okay, what does it actually mean, right? What is the threshold of appropriateness when it comes to relationship building, right? I mean, what does it mean to have a strong relationship with an elected member of the parliament? So are there natural legal boundaries to relationship building in a job of a lobbyist, or is it the more the better?
Mm. So I think there are some important transparency requirements in terms of lobbyists, and this is especially true in Europe, where I think that lobbyists should be open, that you're meeting with and speaking with these people that I mentioned, regulators, experts, legislators, leaders, politicians. And I think that transparency is very important. I think the relationship that you're talking about as well, I'm trying to think this through a little bit. In my experience, these relationships are professional, right?
Mhm.
And everybody knows that I'm advocating for a particular organization. I'm not hiding that when I worked for Amazon, I represent Amazon, or as a consultant now that I represent a certain client, or as a U.S. diplomat, I represented the United States of America.
Sure.
When I walk in the room, that's obvious what I'm there for. And you try to build a constructive, professional, and hopefully a candid relationship with the person that you're meeting with across the table or having coffee with or meeting at a conference. And there's nothing manipulative or sinister about it. It's just you're building those relationships so that later on, when you want to learn something, you can call and ask. And for example, I'd say call you and say, Remy, I understand that you're working on some piece of legislation, and can you tell me a little about it? You might be able to say, oh, right now I can't, Michael. I'm sorry, but maybe later. And I would not think you're trying to hide something from me. I would think that is your honest and sincere answer because we have an ongoing relationship. versus me cold calling someone I don't even know and asking the very same
Sure.
question. I'm sure they're thinking, why is he calling me now? What does he want? And what do I own? What is he going to do with it? Um, and that's perfectly natural, right? That's why the time to build these relationships is to have these ongoing relationships. And these relationships happen socially, although I think that it's not my preferred method to use the people I meet at my kids' sporting events or school, or that I meet socially necessarily, and that are my friends that I play a sport with, as those kind of contexts. But those friendships do sometimes overlap with professional relationships. And then there are other purely professional relationships where you only know the person because of your roles and who you are. And then there are relationships that are purely professional, and I use that sort of entre guillemets, like, in quotes, that you have to deal with these people, but you don't necessarily have a good, constructive, candid relationship with them. But they are the people that need to hear from you, and you need to hear from them. And hopefully, you have some sort of civil and productive interaction, even if you don't have rapport, personal rapport.
That makes a lot of sense, which means, probably the frequency of touch points and cordiality of those exchanges. These are probably aspects that influence the quality of the relationship. And I was thinking, um, relationship building is not a selfless. Well, sometimes it is, but in negotiation, typically it belongs to the category of laying grounds for influence. Yes. Is that aspect stronger in negotiations outside, let's say, business or diplomatic negotiations that you've done before and after, or is it stronger in your lobbying job? So, is this link between the relationship building efforts that you exert in order to do your job better, in order to get ultimately what you intend to get, is this link stronger in lobbying, or is this link stronger in other types of negotiations, interactions?
I think you're spot on that this relationship building is part, as in negotiation and as in lobbying, is part of the preparation stage for having the ongoing relationships in order to eventually influence. We should be honest about that. I mean, that's part of what it is. And it's two-way, right? I mean, I think that
Sure.
it's not just the diplomat or the lobbyist that's influencing the politician or the policymaker or the regulator. It's also the other way around, right? And learning more about each other also helps both sides. It helps one side to comply with and support whatever the regulator, politician, legislator is doing, and it helps the legislator, regulator, or politician to design rules, laws, regulations that the private sector can and is eager or willing, maybe even eager, to implement, right, for whatever reason. And I agree those relationships building is really important. And I've also it struck me that as a former negotiator and what I've read about negotiation theory, that the importance of this, of course, is directly corresponds to ongoing relationships versus one-offs, right? You want to build these kinds of rapport and relationships with people that you're going to have to negotiate with over and over and over and over again. When I spent 3 years at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris, I was sitting around the table with the same 30 some odd people every day. And you want to build the kind of rapport and relationship where you can laugh and talk and gossip and also have difficult conversations and disagree, but the relationship continues. Whereas I have to admit, sometimes if I'm going to buy a car, I won't have that kind of relationship with the person that's selling me the car. And it's more about driving a harder price and not caring about feelings that get hurt and not caring about whether the car dealer actually likes me or wants to have a conversation with me next week, because we're unlikely to engage again. So I think the answer of, how does it differ or is it harder is more about the aspect of that engagement than whether it's for public sector diplomacy, negotiation, or lobbying.
Yeah, got it. That makes a lot of sense. And when you look at various aspects of the negotiation skill spectrum, yes, and think about similarities, differences between the context in which you've applied it, right? I mean, starting with diplomacy, then lobbying, or maybe that's probably the most interesting aspect of it, and then other commercial negotiations. Um, What are the similarities between those contexts, and what are the differences, especially with when we look at the lobbying? Obviously,
Mhm.
looking at it from an outsider's perspective, a layperson's perspective, like myself, yes, lobbying seems to be like an unfinished negotiation, right? Where grounds is laid for an outcome, but the outcome cannot be officially announced as an outcome. Yes, whereas in negotiating trade agreements or buying cars, at the end of the day, there is a transaction or there isn't. Yes. Whereas in lobbying is sort of influencing over time, but without a fixed outcome. I might be completely wrong, and I look forward to your corrections.
So I think you're being too modest of your knowledge and understanding of lobbying in general. Um, Let's talk about a couple of different aspects. One is I think that companies are, and trade associations especially, and there are gatherings of different companies, whether it's a bunch of retail companies or high tech companies or transportation aerospace companies or infrastructure, construction, agricultural. They're often very public with their positions. They will send letters and be very public in the press about, we believe that this legislation should contain the following aspects, and here's why. And we think that these aspects that have been proposed could be counterproductive or even dangerous, and here's why. And I think you'll see at the end of the day, these positions are probably not adopted 100% whole cloth, but you would see aspects of that that will make its way into the final piece of legislation. So as you follow this legislation through its original drafting or rule or regulation, or through its original drafting and development, through the debates in the legislature, whether it's the European Parliament or national parliaments, through the process where member states then with the parliament negotiate back and forth on aspects of a particular regulation or law, you see the influence. Now, at times, being very public about a position could be counterproductive for a particular association or particular company for reputational reasons. But generally, I think most people know where most private sector companies stand, where most of their trade associations stand. But by the way, they also know where the trade unions stand and where the environmental groups stand and where
Sure.
some of the national governments, depending on their politics, might stand on a particular issue because it's put out there in the press. And being put out there in the press and being public about it is a way to influence it as well. So this idea of it's a constantly unfinished negotiation, I can see why that is, and again, I liken it to some of the ongoing multilateral negotiations that, while they result in a particular piece of some sort of resolution or something that comes out of the UN or comes out of the OECD, there's ongoing negotiations and relationships that go on. And I think that lobbying is similar to that, that it may not be about one particular piece of legislation, it may be the ongoing relationship in this area of regulation. But as you see at the end of that, of the regulation. I think what's helpful here, applying again negotiation theories, um, is to try to filter out what you're talking about. These ideas of like, oh, they're out to do something, bad. They're manipulating and they're doing. By the way, on both sides, right? I think both sides somewhat
Sure.
try to do this, and I think that, for example, some companies really strive to be an excellent employer, but they have bottom lines to meet, and maybe they're not giving workers all of the benefits that a trade union thinks is appropriate, or a
Mhm.
particular member state in the EU that has very strong labor protections. But maybe this other company comes from a different culture in East Asia or the Middle East or North America, even where labor rights are not as ensconced in national law. But I think that what you need to do is strip out the emotion and the polemics in all of this and talk about the actual issues at hand and the interests that are being negotiated, right? We talk about this in negotiation too, right? Separate the people from the problem and separate out emotions. And when you let emotions get to you, it can somehow skew the negotiation or work against you. I think that's true in lobbying and in advocacy too. I think trade negotiators that I've worked with, that I've held in very high esteem, always say they're really good at just not at being unflappable and not letting the other side get them all riled up. The ones that get riled up, I think, don't do as well in the negotiations. The ones that get all energized, take a step back, watch, was it watch from the balcony or whatever, And I'm sorry, did I lose you, Remy? I hope I'm back.
Now we're back.
Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry. So take a step back, watch from the balcony to try to take the emotion out of it, and then also look at interests, right? Interest-based negotiation, as you know, is more successful than position. Like, I need you to change this paragraph to this, I need you to change this word to this, is not a useful way to lobby. Rather, a successful way to lobby is often about what is the interest behind both sides? What are we trying to satisfy? And I give you an example of this actually that happened last year. The EU had an important piece of legislation on deforestation, the EU deforestation regulation. And it was supposed to come into effect in December for large companies, December of 2024. However, a lot of the instructions or the data and the technical aspects of implementing law were not ready during 2024. It became difficult for companies like Amazon and other trade association members that we had to be ready to implement this in time. So the system was setting us up for failure. And of course, we were asking for some sort of delay or some sort of change in the implementation of this very important law. It's very important for fighting deforestation in many parts of the world. And it was a centerpiece of the Green Deal that the von der Leyen's first commission mandate had. But at first, we were talking past each other, saying, "You need to delay this, or you need to change this because we can't do this." And the commission said, "This is very important. How can you possibly do this? You're trying to get it out of doing deforestation." And when you just talk about the specifics of it, you lose track of the interests. And at one point, and much to the commission's credit, we met with people from the appropriate DGs as a trade association, and we were meeting with them to talk about, like, you need to delay this and you need to change this, and here's why. And of course, they were very proud of what they had done, and it was a good piece of legislation, and didn't want to dilute it or delay it because that would be against the idea of what they're doing. And I think the conversation changed quite a bit, and I take a bit of credit for this myself. Some of us on the delegation said, look, we support what you're trying to do in terms of deforestation in Southeast Asia or South America through this law. And we would like to be able to comply and implement this law on time, but we can't right now. With the situation the way it is, the instructions and the technical aspects of this don't allow us to do this. And what we want to do is we want you to succeed. We want you to have a successful deforestation regulation that, in fact, is implemented by large companies like the one I worked for and some of the other ones in the trade association, and who can lead the way and make this happen and show the way to how we're going to keep products that actually result in deforestation from being imported into the EU. But we need to work together to make this a success. Like, you have to help us to help you to make this a success. We want to achieve your interests, but you telling us just do it on time and do it with the insufficient information is not going to be successful. And ultimately, a delay came about because I think the commission saw that we were sincere and authentic about that idea, that we were trying for this to be a win. We were trying for all of us to work together toward this laudable goal of trying to stop, or lessen deforestation around the world. But we needed to get back to the actual, what is the goal we're trying to achieve here, and how can we do this together, rather than fighting over the specifics of a particular date of implementation or a specific technical aspect that maybe wasn't ready to do.
That sounds like a great success, and I was wondering, how many instances, or what is the share of instances, lobbying instances, that you've actually experienced that is interest-based joint problem-solving approach on both sides, as instead of this manipulative, hey, I build a relationship so that I can sort of get what I want from you, where both parties come to the table and say, exactly like with the deforestation regulation that you've described. Hey, this is important to us. We want it to be successful. We got the idea of it. We want to help you. Help us help you. But we're facing a problem, and this is the problem. Okay. How many is this common? Yes, or is this a singular event that rarely happens in those interactions?
It certainly wasn't unique or rare, and I do think that a more common one is something about we as the private sector, or whoever is whichever party the onus is on to implement a particular regulation, needs to give feedback back to the regulator to say, this isn't working. how can we make this work? And you may have to change it in order for us to be able to comply, or in order for us to be able to achieve that goal that you want to achieve. And that's an argument that I think lobbyists make a lot of the time. They're not attacking the interest or the issue behind whatever the legislation is. Not always. There are times when, of course, particular interests are against whatever is, but it is not unique to say we're not saying we don't like the goal of this legislation. We're saying that it was designed, as we talked about, by compromise and debate and negotiation and amendment and different political aspects of it to maybe be something which is not easily followed or implemented, and that couldn't we work together to try to make this implemented properly to achieve the goals that you set out, right? I always keep in mind that like the parties, all the parties should come out of this saying like, ooh, we feel good about the fact that we're going to move forward in a way that's going to help us to satisfy our interests and satisfy our goals, right? Similarly, with a negotiation where one side forces the other or tricks the other to do something, those negotiations are often not durable, right? Those negotiations often result in an accord which is very fragile. And I think that lobbying and the regulation and legislation part of it too can have a similar aspect where if there's no trust and if there's trickery or if there are threats or if there's manipulation, then whatever comes out of it will unlikely stand the test of time because there won't be buy-in. There won't be, people won't have skin in the game in order to make this work and make it successful.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad to hear that it's not an isolated case where that happened in the case of the deforestation regulation that you've just kindly described and shared with us. I was wondering, but there are also other examples of legislative initiatives that are a little bit more tricky. Yes, like for example, corporate sustainability due diligence directive. Yes, and I know that it was a highly disputed a lobbying case in the EU, and many companies have tried to let me think how to formulate it. Try to stop it. Let me be blunt. Yes, because it imposed a huge cost burden on large companies. Yes. I don't know to what extent Amazon was included in that pack or not, but there were lots of articles about it where it makes a lot of sense from the overall global perspective to take care about those who cannot take care about themselves by putting pressures on those that can be regulated and can be directly, let's say, punished in case of misbehavior, right? 300 million euro threshold or 350, I don't know what it is at the moment, revenue. Well, it's easy to look at the fingers of larger companies than to change the system for everyone. Yes, and I can imagine that in such cases, looking for working solutions for everyone, it's probably rather difficult, right? Because the interests diverge so strongly that there might not be that these two sets might not even intersect. And so what the regulator might want and what the company might be interested in, these might be two completely different stories without any overlap. What is your experience with cases like those, which are slightly more controversial than deforestation?
Well, let me start with a caveat that I'm not an expert on CSDDD or some of these other due diligence. I did follow them. I did work on them, followed them in the press, and you went to some meetings about them. But I would never call myself an expert on it. I want to remind you
this time you are too modest. This time you are too modest.
It's nice to be accused of being modest. Thank you. I will say that, remember at the beginning of our conversation, we talked about private sector versus being a diplomat and the ratifiers and the constituencies behind you, yeah? You might be interested to know that within certain big corporations and within trade associations and the private sector generally, which is not a monolith, it's quite diverse,
Sure.
there are interests which are pursuing good sustainability and good, labor policies and good that would require this kind of due diligence. There are interests within organizations that are pushing for this and pushing for very strong ones. And also for companies, although big companies are required to, big companies also tend to, for reputational reasons, already hold themselves to a higher standard
Of
of
course.
environmental protection or labor protection or others than would a smaller company that maybe isn't able to or doesn't realize, or and therefore want the playing field to be level and the to raise the standards that everyone has to meet to this higher standard that bigger or more more resource companies could achieve. So there were also those that, oh my gosh, the costs and the burden of doing the CSDDD. What's it going to cost us? What does it look like for the bottom line? And what does that mean? How can we possibly do this? This is going to cost more than the actual business. It's going to cut into our profits, etc. Those interests have to be reconciled, right? Those are our ratifiers. And you have to let that play out to an extent of like, well, what do we like about this? What do we don't like about this? What are the parts that are too onerous? What are the parts that are things that we believe in and want to do? And then you want to also sometimes look at a third way. Maybe it isn't just turn a switch, the toggle switch, turn it on, turn it off. Maybe it's how else can we advance the cause of environmental sustainability and proper labor practices and protections and criminal behavior. I'm trying to think of the other aspects of CSDDD, the due diligence that you have to do. And I'm showing my ignorance. See, I'm proving to you that I wasn't too modest. So and it is a more complicated situation, right? But I think that there was a realization, and I think it came from member states, but it also at the commission that the way it was designed was imbalanced in a couple of ways. One, the requirements were really too burdensome for companies to do and still make a profit and still be profitable. And therefore, it needed to change. It needed to go through this simplification exercise that we're seeing now, where they're reopening the legislation to see how we can make it work better. And this gets back to what I said earlier about help you make this successful. If we can all comply and do this, we'll achieve the goals. If you make it impossible to meet, then it's going to fail. I will say you raised up one issue which I should raise, and this comes from my time at Amazon, is that oftentimes the European Commission, especially the EU legislation, does seem to target the larger, more capable, more resourced organizations. And we see this in the digital area quite a bit, where these very large online platforms, as defined, capture 4 or 5 American companies and maybe 1 or 2 others. But it seems to be targeted at very big, very rich, very powerful companies, and yet let some of the smaller companies, medium-sized companies, the Mittelstand in Germany, or small, medium enterprises that we all want to see develop, leaves them off the hook. And I think there's an issue of fairness there too, right? I think in terms of legislation and in terms of regulation, there should be some sort of test of fairness that everyone is going to have to do this together. It shouldn't just be up to a few small players to somehow meet a standard or pay the price or be vulnerable to these kinds of fines and penalties where others are not. And that is not about lobbying and not about negotiation necessarily, other than what I said before about if something is seen as being unfair, if something is seen as being forced upon someone without their input and without taking into consideration, it then becomes fragile and it becomes a source of complaint in the future and may in fact shade or even poison future negotiations, future discussions of what's going on. If you remember, back when you were regulating digital companies, you went after, the 5 US companies. That's something that's not forgotten necessarily. And I think that is not necessarily helpful for keeping the relationship productive, constructive, and ongoing. And that begins to address a little bit of what I think you're talking about, although you're smiling and laughing at what I'm talking about. But I hope that does begin to sort of respond to what you were saying.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And thank you for sharing this. Yes, this is so lobbying efforts can be successful, like, for example, in the case of deforestation and probably many other cases that you've witnessed and been a part of, but they can also fail. Yes, looking back at your career, be it that as a diplomat / lobbyist for the U.S. Or lobbyist for Amazon. Any failures that come to your mind, or only success?
Too many failures, actually. We don't have time left in the podcast to talk about them all. Um, One
Too
thing that I
humble
feel
again.
that I feel very sad about actually is TTIP, the
Yeah.
Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, because I really believe that both sides wanted a comprehensive trade and investment agreement. If you were looking at the interests, if you were looking at the benefits, both sides, I really understood the what was going to be beneficial about this, how it was going to redound to each country and is going to make their populations and their private sectors and their societies better. It's a very important, the transatlantic marketplace is very important, very big, and to take down barriers and to try to have as free flow of trade, investment, services, digital as possible, I think was of interest to both sides and explicitly. And instead, we got caught up, I think, in a lot of the issue negotiation. I only have to say the two words, chlorine chicken, and everyone knows what I mean. It's all about chlorinated chicken, right? Or it's all about some other. Or it's all for the Belgians. It was, the right to dredge in U.S. waters and the Jones Act. There were these very specific issues that became obstacles to the agreement, and as a result, it dragged on and dragged on too long, and there was some bad feeling. And even though during the rounds of negotiation we made progress, we never got to a deal. And I think that that's a tragedy and an example of when you let these issues overtake the greater importance of the interests. And I'm sorry that happened, I guess. The United States also we fail often, I think, in multilateral organizations because sometimes we are arrogant. We're very, we're the United States can be the 900-pound gorilla in the room, 900-kilo gorilla in the room. And oftentimes we come in and we sort of make demands or we want something, and it has the opposite effect. It hardens, I think, opposition against what we wanted. Whereas we came in again a little more in listening mode, a little more understanding, we would get to a place where we could come to some sort of agreement that also took into account the interests of the other side. Um, I think in the UN we do this quite a bit. In the past, of course, we were often staunch supporters of Israel and the Security Council, often to the detriment of reasonable resolutions about Palestinians and what was happening there. And the United States just had a policy of, and I think as a result, we had to sometimes wield our veto in order to stop these. And that's not a success. That's a failure of negotiation. It's a better negotiation if you get people in the Security Council on board with a balanced resolution that captures the interests of all of the members. And so I don't think it was always difficult for me as a US diplomat to make that case and know that, whether it was the Jamaicans or the Colombians or the Zambians, they weren't going to support us, the Security Council on this, even though we made our best because we weren't necessarily listening and taking in all of the other interests so that everybody was on board. I think that's another difficult one. I'm glad I'm no longer a U.S. diplomat because if I said this on a podcast, I'm sure it would affect my career. But so those are sort of two examples of failures. But you learn from failures too, right? From your experiences when things don't work, you look back and you think, oh, okay, so why didn't that work? What went wrong in this particular case, and how can we make it better in the future? And I think that oftentimes your negotiating partners will be helpful in that, especially if you have good and ongoing relationships. They will tell you, frankly, I wanted to help you on this, but you made it impossible by doing this and this, by doing X and Y.
Exactly.
And I found that as well when I was working on Syria, for example, on our defeating of ISIS and the reconstruction in northeast Syria, that we had our allies, France and Britain, along with us too, who were very much, on board with we need to defeat terrorism. ISIS is part of the whole war on terrorism. It's part of the whole war on Al Qaeda, and we are with you lock, stock, and barrel to defeat ISIS in northeast Syria and Iraq. By the time I came into the scene in 2018, it was more northeast Syria. However, the US started making about broader issues than just Syria, than just ISIS. It was also about the Syrian regime and the opposition and the Assad regime and Iran. And that became a very difficult issue for the French and British to say, look, our mandate for having military presence here and for the resources and for us is a counterterrorism, anti-ISIS mandate. And if you start saying that this is about containing Iran or this is about, responding to Russia, as awful as whatever the Russian activities against civilians in Syria were, it's going to put us in a difficult position. And I think that, again, you have to be aware of the constraints and the interests of the other side as you build these alliances and going forward.
And that makes a lot of sense. And yes, absolutely, we can learn just as much, if not more, from our failures as negotiators, lobbyists, as we can from our successes, right? And we attribute everything to us, to our skills, to the things that we did correctly or at least appropriately. Um, and in case of failure, it's significantly more difficult, but still important. I was thinking, you mentioned TTIP, Michael, and international trade has been on the first pages of many newspapers in the last couple of weeks, and if not months, at least since the Liberation Day, the new Liberation Day in April. And I was wondering, if spontaneously, if our podcast is, by the way, streamed and listened to all over the world. And if a member of foreign services of, I don't know, Lesotho, that was hit particularly hard by new tariffs, or South Africa, or any other countries that somehow feel that their new tariff rates, average or effective tariff rates, are simply too high, unsustainable, and they would love to hire lobbyists to help them in Washington to sort of change the status quo. Would you take that project?
Yeah, I think I would take that project actually, because I think that um, President Trump's a deal maker. He's looking for deals. He's looking, and I think in the very few deals that we have seen with EU, with Japan, Korea, some others, there's been aspects. By the way, sometimes it's not trade related. You have to kind of open your mind more broadly to issues
I
that are
know,
not
yeah,
directly related
exactly.
to trade. But I think that even the Lesotho's, the South Africa, some Southeast Asian countries that are facing very high tariffs, should really look at, what can I bring? What can I do? Get back to the interests. What are the interests? Their explicit interests that the U.S. government has said. We want to address trade imbalances. If you have a trade deficit, if your country has a trade surplus with the United States, what are you going to do to address that? Are you going to have voluntary export restraints? Are you going to have commitments to buy more U.S. goods? That might be part of it. Another issue is the U.S. is looking for revenue for its tax breaks. So the tariffs are part of that as well. Is there another way that your country can help the United States to increase tax revenues in some way? Think about it in a very creative way. I don't think Lesotho is necessarily going to invest in large new factories in America, but maybe some other countries could. I think that some tariffs that have been put on countries as a result of more political and less trade-oriented policies, and I think South Africa and Brazil might fall into that category. Ask
Yeah.
yourselves, well, what is it that we have done that has brought this response from Washington, and how can we try to undo this? Again, I think building relationships with the people or the decision makers or the people around them, trying to have candid conversations and building trust with them, and then keeping the lines of communication open to better understand what are the interests that we're trying to satisfy here and address here will help you along the way. I wouldn't promise you that that's going to solve the problem, but certainly staying at home and worrying about it and stressing about it isn't going to help either. And I don't think there's a magical thing you can do. I think it's probably bespoke. I think it's probably unique to every country what the situation is. But I do think that talking it through and thinking about creatively about ways to satisfy the interest that Washington is pretty explicit and open about what they want, ways that you can help them to achieve those goals would result in you having maybe a better situation on the tariff front.
So, guys out there, if you're thinking about what to do with your tariff rates right now, there is a very good lobbyist that I can recommend. That's Michael Koplovsky. You should definitely reach out to him. You'll find him on LinkedIn, and make sure you have at least a good conversation about what could be done as, in those difficult situations to change the status quo. Speaking of which, Michael, how is performance of lobbyists measured? Especially, I mean, Amazon is known for measuring performance, right? I mean,
Right.
if there is one company that I can think of that ties, I don't know, compensation and promotions with performance, the first name that comes to my mind is actually Amazon. Yeah?
Mm.
Do they also do it for lobbyists? And if yes, how do they measure success of lobbyists in a commercial context?
Mm. I think it's more difficult to measure success in public policy and government affairs than it is in other aspects. If
Mm.
I make my sorting facility more efficient, I can show you the numbers, right? I can show you the cost
Yeah.
savings. However, if I keep a piece of legislation from occurring, which is going to be anathema to our business model, there's no way to measure that. Uh, there is a way to say, if this law is passed, this is how much it might cost. This is what the cost of compliance would be. This is what the cost of the business would be, the cost of efficiency. Hey, it didn't happen. So therefore, those costs were then recouped. And we did some of that analysis at Amazon where this and this and this are like, by the way, this is also helpful in helping us to identify our BATNA. And maybe there are cases where we're not going to have, this is what's going to cost. Maybe we can live with that in a particular
Exactly.
regulation or situation, right? I mean, there are these again these overlaps with negotiation that happen. Um, so there is a way to measure what's happening. There's also a way to measure things that we've lobbied for, which have lowered tax burden or opened up new markets. And you can say, look, this market in this new country, because we were successful in our lobbying and advocacy efforts, has opened up, and look how much revenue we're bringing in every year. But I will say you're quite right. It's not evident. It's not self-evident. And I used to joke when I was a diplomat, we often had I had political appointee ambassadors, right? They were friends of the president or had been fundraisers, and they would show up at an embassy, and they had come from their Silicon Valley startup or from their business or their bank in New York, and they would say, "Okay, we're gonna run this like a business from now on, this embassy." And I would say, "Oh, so we're going to have 2% more diplomacy this quarter, ambassador?" And it's hard often to talk about this. I had another ambassador where he wanted to achieve certain goals, right, in order to be able to show our performance. Like we achieved this and this and this, and I said, well, sometimes keeping bad things from happening is our job. Like there are 4 bad things which could have happened that we made sure didn't occur. That's also good, but hard to measure because it's the counter example, right? So I think you're quite right. It's hard to do it. I think Amazon does a pretty good job of trying to quantify and analyze, as you say. That's at the heart of what Amazon is and does. But generally, this is more of a social science than a hard science, I think, or mathematic in terms of how you get your messages out, how you change reputation, how you adjust the conversation, how you build trust, how you get some of the aspects that we're talking about into legislation regulation, and also understand better the situation is a person to person humanity skill more so than a quantifiable mathematical skill.
Mathematical skill. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Which means you guys were sort of an island, right, where some of the general principles and rules applied, but you could somehow also argue that it's not math, it's social science, which is not always perfectly measurable.
Well, I argued that with you. I don't think I argued it internally in the organization.
All right, Michael, 2 more questions. Last 2 questions. One is lessons learned. So looking back at your career as a lobbyist slash negotiator, advocate, if you were to share, let's say, one piece of advice, the most important piece of advice that sort of summarizes it all, if possible, yes, what would that
Wow,
be?
that's a very tall order. I know it's hard because I think when I'm sort of looking back at my younger self, right? Some years ago, you get very caught up in the issue of the day, the issue that needs to be accomplished today or tomorrow or this week. And if you should really take a long view, you should look at the horizon and judge progress. Progress isn't always linear directly towards the goal, but progress is happening. And you should take, even though you may have to tack to the right or the left in order to get to the destination, you are looking at that point on the horizon, the destination that you're going to and making progress toward. As I mentioned earlier, I think getting too energized or emotional about a particular issue is
Mm,
counterproductive. It's best if you can control your emotions. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be emotional. In fact, I had an ambassador once who used anger very, very well, but he was able to turn it on and off in
mm.
order to have a negotiation. But don't let it get to you, and remember to ground yourself in the fact that if you've done your homework and you have the relationships and you are confident in yourself, but also open to other explanations and understandings, and don't get again energized by the emotional aspects of it. I think you'll be more effective, you'll make better decisions, and you'll have probably stronger and better relationships with those you're negotiating with and those you are advocating with.
Oh, that's a whole set of it, a whole package of advice. But thank you so
I'm
much.
learning from my mistakes all the time. I mean, that's like what I told you we do.
I'm sure there were not that many of those. So my last question is always the same, and it refers to greatness. Greatness in negotiation, great negotiators, be it contemporary, historical, as you wish. Anyone comes to your mind when you think about greatness in negotiation?
Yeah, so this is a personal one, actually. I worked for a man named Peter Allgaier, who was the deputy U.S. trade representative in the U.S. and eventually our ambassador to the WTO in Geneva. And he had all those aspects I just talked about. He was always in a good mood. He was unflappable. He had a good sense of humor. He was serious. And he also had a very smart mind about thinking about creative ways to get past obstacles or to the solution. I was always trying to think like, well, okay, there's a wall here, and we tunnel into the wall. Do we jump over the wall? Do we knock down the wall? Do we go on the... And he said, well, why is there a wall there? So it's he would always, or he'd say something like, well, there's a helicopter over there, or something. I mean, he always had the creative way to get around the obstacle to a negotiation, and yet was always extremely personable, extremely nice, took care of his colleagues on his side of the table and also those he was negotiating on the other side of the table. And I think many of my colleagues at USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and in the U.S. Diplomatic Corps do look to Peter Allgaier as somebody who's a great negotiator and a good human being too. Ironically, I learned while I was working for him that when he was an undergraduate, and I think it was at Brown, it's one of the Ivy League schools, he studied theology. And maybe that's the best preparation for negotiation, lobbying, and advocacy.
At least in terms of its ethical parts. Michael, it's been a treat. It's been a great pleasure and honor having you here with us. Thank you so much for sharing so much um, intimate insights about the job, a job of a lobbyist. I hope we demystified it a little bit. I hope that our listeners and viewers will perceive it as an ongoing negotiation, especially focused on relationship building. Yeah. And there's a lot more. There are a lot more questions I would love to ask you, Michael, but we're approaching our time limit, and I would like to thank you for joining us this time. All the best, guys. Remember, if you look for a great lobbyist, there is one that certainly understands his trade very, very well, and that's Michael Koplovsky. Michael, thank you so much.
Remy, thank you so much. This has been a delight talking with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of my experiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you.